The analysis highlights that the European Union and the United States maintain the largest bilateral trade relationship globally, with a combined exchange approaching $2 trillion in goods and services. It emphasizes that this volume surpasses U.S.-China trade and even exceeds trade between the U.S. and its neighboring partners, Canada and Mexico. The narrative underscores that this relationship is relatively balanced when both goods and services are considered holistically. From a structural perspective, both blocs exchange roughly equivalent value, reinforcing a mutually beneficial dynamic. The commentary notes that shared cultural, legal, and business frameworks further facilitate this extensive trade integration. However, the analysis points out a recent shift driven by U.S. tariff policies and increasingly confrontational rhetoric toward EU members. It presents the view that regardless of political motivations, economists widely warn of risks to both the U.S. and European economies. The European side is portrayed as particularly vulnerable due to its deep trade dependence and limited control over U.S. policy decisions. This situation has prompted EU nations to reassess the extent and desirability of their reliance on the United States. The discussion raises the critical question of whether Europe could realistically decouple from this relationship and at what cost. It frames such a decoupling as one of the most significant potential economic disruptions in modern history. The analysis stresses that Europe faces this challenge while already dealing with internal economic weaknesses across major member states. It likens the timing of such a transition to undertaking an extreme challenge under already strained conditions. Beyond Europe, the narrative situates this issue within a broader geopolitical realignment, dividing the world into competing blocs. One bloc is described as centered on the U.S., while another is informally aligned around China's industrial capacity. This polarization raises the possibility of middle powers seeking cooperation to reduce dependence on dominant global players. However, the analysis questions whether such a strategy could be achieved without imposing significant economic costs on populations. It also introduces uncertainty by noting that political changes could alter the trajectory of current tensions in a relatively short time frame. The discussion then transitions to the historical origins of the transatlantic partnership following World War II. It explains that the relationship was deliberately constructed to counter Soviet influence and stabilize Western economies. The Marshall Plan is identified as the economic foundation of this partnership, with $13 billion in U.S. aid distributed to Europe. This aid came with conditions aimed at fostering trade integration and economic liberalization. It also notes unintended consequences, such as strengthening the global role of the U.S. dollar. The plan is presented as highly successful, driving rapid European recovery and industrial growth by 1950. Additionally, it laid the groundwork for institutions such as NATO and eventually the European Union. The narrative concludes that this period cemented U.S. geopolitical dominance and established Europe's long-term alignment. The analysis then shifts to examining the depth of current economic interdependence between the two regions. It reiterates the nearly $2 trillion annual trade volume and details key export categories on both sides. European exports are characterized by high-end machinery, pharmaceuticals, and automobiles. U.S. exports to Europe are described as including machinery, energy products, and chemicals. The commentary emphasizes that these are foundational goods, essential to both economies. It also highlights mutual dependencies, such as U.S. reliance on European machinery and Europe's reliance on U.S. energy and technology. The analysis addresses the common perception of a U.S. trade deficit with Europe. It clarifies that this perception is based primarily on goods trade and excludes services. When services are included, the imbalance shifts, with Europe running a deficit of over $100 billion in services. This broader view reinforces the conclusion that the relationship is more balanced than commonly portrayed. It frames this as a textbook example of comparative advantage within globalization. However, it notes that globalization itself is under pressure due to supply chain vulnerabilities and rising geopolitical tensions. The analysis suggests that political narratives often focus on goods trade because it is more tangible and easier to communicate. It also raises the point that technological advances may make services more replaceable than physical resource dependencies. The discussion then expands to include foreign direct investment as a critical component of the relationship. It identifies the EU-US investment link as the largest in the world, accounting for nearly 2/3 of US foreign investment. European firms are shown to play a major role in supporting over 3 million jobs in the United States. Conversely, Europe remains the primary destination for US investment flows. This reinforces the idea that the relationship extends far beyond trade into deeply integrated economic systems. The analysis introduces the global financial system, focusing on SWIFT as key infrastructure enabling international transactions. It explains that despite being based in Brussels, SWIFT is heavily influenced by the US due to dollar dominance. This gives the US significant leverage through its ability to impose financial sanctions. The example of sanctions on Russia is used to illustrate the system's effectiveness and impact. The narrative concludes that Europe's reliance on this system limits its strategic autonomy. It suggests that achieving independence would require developing alternative financial infrastructure. However, the analysis notes that replicating SWIFT's scale and coordination would be extremely challenging. It references alternative systems developed by BRICS nations, China, and Russia as partial attempts at independence. Despite these efforts, SWIFT's global reach remains unmatched. The discussion then highlights Europe's recent efforts to diversify its economic partnerships. It cites the EU-Mercosur agreement as a major step toward expanding trade with Latin America. This agreement is described as covering over 700 million people and valued at more than 111 billion euros. It also notes growing interest in cooperation with the CPTPP trade bloc in the Pacific region. If realized, such partnerships could create a large trade network independent of both the US and China. The analysis then evaluates which European countries would be most affected by a potential decoupling. Germany is identified as the most exposed due to its export-driven economy. It highlights Germany's reliance on exporting nearly half of its manufactured goods. The US is noted as Germany's largest export market, with over $180 billion in annual exports. This dependency makes Germany particularly vulnerable to trade disruptions. The analysis explains that Germany's Mittelstand model, while highly efficient, increases exposure to global market shifts. It warns that reduced access to US markets could lead to unemployment and economic contraction. Ireland is presented as another highly exposed economy.